Now, we're here today with Molly Pisani, who is an independent contractor, and her company is called Starsplitter Editorial Services. She comes out of the editorial world in New York, living, I believe, in Brooklyn, right, Molly?
And Queens now. Queens.
You're in Queens. Well, that's it. My native Queens. That's fantastic.
That's right.
Welcome, Molly.
Thank you.
Well, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about your consulting company and what you do.
Okay. Yeah. Well, so I guess maybe I'll start by talking about my journey. Well, so first of all, my company is an editorial services company, and the reason for the slightly more generic name is that I do several kinds of editing. I started out in trade publishing as a developmental editor, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. So developmental editing is, of course, editing for content, editing for logic, editing, if you're doing a novel, it's things like character development and plot continuity and all of those things, as opposed to some of the more language-focused kinds of editing that I also provide. So in addition to developmental editing, I do line editing, then I do copy editing and proofreading, which is really a different technical world, and for a lot of editors, they don't overlap. I would think a pretty large percentage of editors are either content editors or, copy editors and proofreaders, but not both. I will explain, more about why that is for me in a minute, but so I provide both of those kinds of services for developmental editing, mostly to private clients who are, independent authors who would maybe like to get an agent, would like to get a publishing contract, or are just planning to publish their work themselves, but in either case, they want to publish, to the highest possible quality. So they want to polish up their manuscripts before they send it on to the next step. And I provide, feedback that helps them do that. I also, in terms of copy editing and proofreading, work frequently with major trade publishers to copy edit the manuscripts that they are putting into production. So I started out in publishing in 2006. I took the Columbia Publishing course, which is a 6-week summer course that's been administered through Columbia University for a long time, but before that was hosted at, Harvard and Radcliffe. And that sort of teaches you a little bit about what the publishing industry is like. Another way of looking at it is that it's a little bit like joining a Rotary Club, because I would say probably the biggest advantage, like, you learn things about publishing, but one of the biggest advantages of going is that you meet people who you will work with in the industry for the rest of your career. And so I did that, and out of the course, I was able to get a job working for 2 literary agencies that shared an administrative/editorial assistant. And I worked for those agencies for about 1.5 years. And then I decided that I really wanted to try being in editorial rather than at an agency, because the career path for agents is essentially you start out as an assistant, and then in order to move up, you either have to find a way to take on clients on top of your administrative responsibilities, or you have to take a financial leap and be paid very little or nothing except the commission that you make from selling projects. So you can either kind of do 2 jobs at once until you can give it up and just do the 1 job, or you can give up the financial security of the assistant stuff and just start trying to sell. And I was not really comfortable with either of those things. And also, I just had come to understand that, sometimes agents work deeply with a particular text, a particular manuscript. Sometimes agents will work for years with an author to develop a manuscript to the point where they think it's ready to be sold to a publisher. But sometimes they don't. And working with text was something that I really wanted to do more closely. So I thought, okay, I'll try editorial. And so I got a job at a division of HarperCollins that was called Collins. It was a new nonfiction initiative. And that was in 2008. I started in March of 2008. And by February of 2009, the entire economy had collapsed and we all lost our jobs. So I got another job at Simon & Schuster, which is the flagship imprint of the larger company of the same name. And I worked there for another 5 years, I think, in the editorial department. And I definitely started moving up the chain, you know, started acquiring some projects, started, you know, editing alongside my bosses on their own projects, which was really good practice. But ultimately, I kind of came to this place where I had gotten to the level of associate editor, which is right before the job title where you stop having to work for someone else. You generally, by the time your title is just editor, that is the moment when you are no longer scheduling somebody else's lunch meetings and sending out their packages. And I had turned 30 and said, okay, you know, like, here I am at this point where I could be working under somebody else for possibly another 2 or 3 years before I just get to handle my own stuff. And it doesn't pay all that well, and it takes up all of my time. And if I succeed in becoming an editor, it's only going to take up more of my time and still not pay all that well. And so at that point, I just decided that it kind of wasn't the right life for me, because it's different depending on how big of a publisher that you work for. But if you work for a big corporate publisher in the editorial department, it's, you know, you're in the office all day and you're not editing. You're going to jacket meetings and sales meetings, and you're doing conference calls, and you're having acquisitions meetings with authors you're interested. And, you know, then when you go home, your nights and weekends are the time when you are supposed to be editing your manuscripts and reading your submissions, but also the time when you are supposed to be connecting with agents who might send you projects, and the time when you are supposed to be attending events for your authors because they have books coming out and you have to be there to support them. And it's just, it is a never-ending job, and it's tough to stick it out and make it. You know, a lot of people do a couple of years in publishing and then just decide the grind is not for them. I took a little longer to decide that because I loved the job. I mean, I worked with incredibly smart and interesting people, and, you know, that was great. And I was getting to work with text, but I just didn't want all of the extra stuff anymore. I didn't want the jacket meetings. I didn't want the, you know, endless memos. And I had, not that long after I started at Simon & Schuster, started doing copy editing and proofreading type work on the side for Simon & Schuster's own production department, because I had a friend down there who, you know, I brought him a book one day that we had recently published, and he had been the production editor on, and I said to him, man, this book was so great. Did you notice that the word 14 is spelled without the R 6 different times?
Ooh.
And he was like, no, I didn't notice that. And a lot of people read this book and also didn't notice that. I bet you would be good at this work. And I was good at it, and it actually paid more than my editorial salary, particularly when you break down on an hourly basis, you know, in terms of how many hours you put in to the concept of being an editor versus the number of hours you put into the concept of being a proofreader or whatever. That work paid more than the work that I had. So I took it on the side and did it for about 4 years while I was working at Simon & Schuster. And when I started to realize that I was not on the right path for myself, I thought, okay, I have heard that people, you know, do freelance editing, and I don't know how hard or easy that is to make a living at, but I know I can do this work. I can do, you know, the copy editing and the proofreading, and I know it pays at least as much as I make now, you know, if not more, depending on how much I do. So maybe now is the time to make a transition while I still, don't have responsibilities to, like, I don't have kids, I don't have a huge number of financial responsibilities. So maybe I need to plan something else for myself while it's still easy. And I did, and it was easily the best thing I've ever done for myself. There was like a run of, I'm going to say 3 or 4 years, where I just felt like I was on some kind of weird vacation. Because all of a sudden, like, I was doing the work that I love, but I did it completely on my own time. I virtually never had to answer the phone. I could just do things on my own schedule. If I made a mistake, I had complete authority to fix the problem with the client. I wasn't going to have a boss yell at me, because my boss was me, and she's pretty forgiving. And it's just been really great. And then I did go and have a kid, and that, made life more complicated. So now I'm not on vacation anymore ever. But, that part at least is avoidable for anybody who is interested in following in my footsteps as a freelance editor. So I don't know, sometimes when I first left Simon & Schuster, I used to sometimes say that if I had it all to do over again, maybe I would have been happier in the marketing department. And in some ways that might be true. Other departments like marketing or publicity are easier to move up in than editorial, because there's somewhat less demand. I mean, everybody wants to be the editor, right? Like, everybody wants to be the next Maxwell Perkins or whatever. So if you work in marketing or publicity or another department, it is easier to get more responsibility and more pay faster. I don't think I could have been happy unless I tried it. I think that I had to try being an editor in order to really know that it wasn't what I wanted, that corporate career wasn't going to be a good fit for me. I just don't think I would have been satisfied if I hadn't given it a shot. And it did teach me a lot. It's hugely helpful as a freelancer to have that branding behind you and be able to say, well, I was at Simon & Schuster for many years, and here's how we did things then. And, I am able to provide people with a lot of insight, and frankly, I'm able to charge a little bit more for that insight. I'm comfortable doing that because I think that I'm giving people something that not necessarily every freelance editor can provide. So it isn't exactly that I wouldn't recommend going into corporate publishing. I would just say it's a very particular kind of environment. And, if you really want to be focused on the books and not so much on developing your career, it can be a hard place to be. It's something for people to think about, because if you work for even a smaller publisher, for example, you're really publishing the books that you want to publish because there's kind of no point in doing anything else. Like, it's hard enough to be a small publisher, and it's not that there aren't financial considerations involved, but there's not the same pressure to generate money for the sake of generating money. In corporate publishing, particularly if you work for a publicly traded publisher, Simon & Schuster is owned by CBS, Viacom, whatever it is, and we put out quarterly results to the stock market. And when there's that kind of pressure to make money because money, you sometimes publish things less because you love them and more because you know that you can sell them. And it's important to know how to sell a book that you're publishing, but it's nice to just be able to say, I'm working on what I want to work on. I don't have to take on, as a freelancer, I can say to myself, this project would be lucrative, but I don't feel like it. I don't want it. Or frankly, sometimes this author seems difficult. I'm going to give it a pass. And to have that kind of control for me is more important than anything else.
Wow,
That's the story.
that's really incredible in terms of how many decisions you had to make on so many different kind of platforms about life, about editing, about the commercial world, and the literary world. So at this stage, Molly, how do clients come to you?
I would say at this point, maybe predominantly they come to me through word of mouth, and sometimes that means authors that I've previously worked with who have said, oh, I had this great editor. Sometimes it means other editors. You know, I'm part of some kind of informal groups of folks who will, you know, post to a listserv and say, oh, hey, you know, I have this person who seems like a good client, but I can't take on this project right now. You know, if anybody else is available, feel free to reach out to them. I also am a member of what's called the Editorial Freelancers Association. And that was something that was very helpful early on because they have a free online directory of their members. And so before I was willing to sink time or money into making a website of my own, I was able to be in their member directory, and that improved my searchability a lot. I had a really lucky break early on in my freelance career in that I worked with an author who came to me because he said, I had this manuscript. I have sold several things for television before and watched them disappear into a vault and never come out. I don't want to do that. So I've been writing this novel and I want to self-publish it because I want to have more control. But, you know, I'd like you to line edit it first. And I did. And I said kind of, hey, this book is really good. Are you sure you want to self-publish it? And he was like, well, I don't know. And it finally occurred to me that I had one friend in an editorial department who I was like, if she's not the person who understands exactly what this book is and who it's for, then nobody is. So I said, let me just send it to this one editor. And he said, okay. And she looked at it and fell in love with it and ended up publishing it. And so for him, that kind of Cinderella story of I worked with a freelance editor and it landed me a major publishing deal. They decided to sort of use that as part of the marketing campaign for the book. So my name would sometimes pop up in articles about his novel. His name's Stephen Rowley. The novel was called Lily and the Octopus. And it is a great novel and you should totally read it. But, you know, so occasionally I will still get people being like, hey, I read your name on the internet because you helped somebody else get a book deal. Can you help me get a book deal? And I have to be like, no, that's not really what I do. The reason for that being that I think it's ethically questionable. You don't want people to get the impression that the service they are buying from you is insider access to editors. That's not what I do. You know, I definitely do everything I can to help people put their best foot forward, you know, in the process of querying agents or in the process of, you know, querying publishing houses that don't require an agent or whatever. But that was something that I want to make sort of a clear line for people. It's important to me that they understand that I'm not a, I don't know what you call it. Ironically, I'm going to not know some words now because I'm an editor and not knowing words is what I should do, right? I am not a person who makes
so many
deals.
words
I'm not
that, you know, it's hard to choose one.
I'm not the publishing, you know, godfather being like, I know a guy. No, you know, I can edit your manuscript and, you know, very occasionally it has been true that I have connected people to other people who I thought they really needed to know. But when people ask me, I say, no, that's not a service that I provide because if I choose to do it, it's over and above what I do. But that was, you know, I mean, having your name appear in newspaper articles about somebody who got a fabulous publishing deal is inevitably going to bring a certain number of people to your door. And sometimes I end up working with those people and sometimes I don't. It varies a lot. But that was something that is not part of how most people build their freelance careers that happened to work out well for me. And if it hadn't happened, I might have to be better at marketing myself than I am.
Right.
Like, I really don't like marketing myself, as many editors do not, but I will say that it's an important skill. And I spent at least the first year that I was a freelancer going, well, I never wanted to run a business. And it took me a little bit of time to accept that it doesn't matter whether I ever wanted to be somebody who runs my own business, because now I do. And so I need to suck it up and take that seriously, and I need to think about things like how I present myself to the public. And I need to think about things like how I can do outreach and find more clients, because I'm in business whether I want to be a business person or not. So that was something I think actually a lot of freelancers struggle with. Like, they just think, oh, I just want to work on books. I don't really have to make a living at it. But if you think about it, you come to realize that nobody else is out there doing it for you. Nobody else is going to make sure that you make a living at what you do. So you better be the one to take it seriously and make sure, like, recalculate every once in a while, like, how much time am I spending on this project? Am I making an appropriate rate for the time it takes? Like, because if you don't take care of that business, nobody else will. And it'll be your life that gets made harder, not anybody else's. So.
Right. Molly, you mentioned earlier that that many people do either copy editing and proofreading or content editing, but you do both. What's the difference there, and how is it that you find yourself doing both?
They're two really different kinds of work, and one of the things that I like about doing both is that the content stuff, the developmental stuff, feels very creative, and it's fun to be, not telling an author what to do, but collaborating with them and saying, hey, it seems to me that there's this element of your character that, could really have an effect on what they do in this story, but it's not being pulled out yet. It's not being used to full effect. Like, am I wrong in reading that kind of intention into this person? And then the author will say, oh, you're right, that is sort of there, isn't it? Or they'll say, no, that's not at all what I meant to have come across, and, make revisions accordingly. But so it's not that I think that I'm here to, tell an author how their manuscript should work, but it can be fun to sometimes help people see what they haven't necessarily seen before in their own work. But just in terms of the style of it, you really can't edit productively for content unless you can sit down and sink into it for, I'm going to say, at least 2 uninterrupted hours. It's not the kind of work that you can dip in and out of. And there are times when, if I'm wrestling with something in a manuscript, like, I can see a problem, but I can't fully articulate what it is, or I can't think of different ways to suggest to the author that they might solve it, I might have to put it away for a day or two and not think about it at all, because sometimes when I come back to it, the same as for an author, I'll be able to see it or talk about it differently. Copy editing and proofreading is also creative in its way. It requires, I think, a lot more inventiveness and flexibility and engagement than people give it credit for. Because again, most people think copy editors are, here to slap you over the wrist with a ruler if you don't use, like, the subjunctive correctly or whatever. What a copy editor is really supposed to do is enforce consistency and clarity as best they can, while still having respect for the author's individual voice. So a lot of things in copy editing are not right or wrong so much as they are style choices. You can do it this way, or you can do it this way. The author tends to do it this way, so we're just going to make sure it gets done that way every single time it comes up. And that kind of work is more methodical. It's easier to step in and out of. You can do it for half hour at a time before, it's not something where if you get pulled out of it by some other aspect of your life, you really lose the thread. So for me, like now that I do have a child and I work independently, it's been very helpful sometimes to just be able to say, okay, I just need to sit down and put in some hours on this. And it's not a situation where I have to worry that I'm not bringing my best self to the work. You sit down and you start reading that manuscript word for word for word for word for word until it's done. And so I really like having that balance. Like even before I had a kid, it was nice sometimes to finish a big developmental editing project. And the last stage of that is often writing this very elaborate, like 7 or 10 or 15-page memo where I'm going through the manuscript comment by comment and constructing this, complex document, trying to show the author what I think, would work better for them. And sometimes it is really nice to get one of those off your desk and be like, okay, the next thing I have to do is just read this book according to the style sheet, check for the Oxford comma in every list of items, and move on with my life, But I think the reason that it's not particularly common necessarily for people to do both of those things is that because they are really different work modes, some people have a strong preference for one or the other. Copy editing and proofreading is something where you need to have formal training. It's not necessarily extensive training, but you need to have some formal training in how it gets done for the book trade. I took a course through NYU's School of Continuing Professional Studies that's called, I think, Fundamentals of Copy Editing and Proofreading. And that is the course that I am told every publisher's production department makes their people take. You can also, the University of California at San Diego has a whole certificate in copy editing that's a lot more of an investment of time, but that I think probably trains you more elaborately to work in different kinds of copy editing. Like if people want to do like medical or STEM copy editing or whatever, that's kind of a different planet, and UCSD can teach you how to do it. But developmental editing is something that often people, if they've been through an MFA program, have some idea of how to do, and I think actually for me, I wasn't an English major or a writing major in college. I studied American Studies with a focus on popular culture, and it was super cool, but it didn't teach me a vocabulary necessarily for talking about writing. And so I'm usually able to get across what I want, but I do think it was valuable for me to have the experience of working under other editors in a publishing house, because I would read their editorial memos and I would see, my boss would say, hey, can you photocopy this 400-page manuscript and, send it off to the author? And I would have the chance to sit there and see page by page, in the memo and in the manuscript comments, what my boss had done to the book. And I think for me, not having had prior training as a writer, that education was really important. But for somebody who has experience as a writer, it's maybe easier to say, I have some of the necessary tools to be an editor. Although I wonder sometimes to what extent it might take more practice for somebody who's been a writer to learn how to edit other people while essentially staying out of their business. Like when you're a writer, you're used to having charge of the story. And I think as an editor, it actually is really critical to not believe that you are in control. And I don't know, like I said, having no experience as a writer, I don't know how much of a shift in mentality that is for people to accomplish.
Right. I think that's absolutely true, that it's a kind of a shared collaborative effort. And even in the copy editing, I was just talking to a couple of copy editors who were in the Wilkes program. It's Carly Stasko and Janine Dubik. And we were talking about, the fact that, like, when I got a manuscript back from a university press of my own, and I looked at it and I realized this person doesn't really hear me at all. You know, they're not. And at first it's disconcerting because you think I'm wrong. You know, you go back to the nuns are still perched
right
there.
exactly. Yeah,
thinking,
the way
I
we
got that wrong.
taught grammar.
And then you start realizing, but it doesn't sound, if you say it, it doesn't sound right. So I think that notion that you brought up of saying, you know, this is about a shared project, and you have to intuit, even with the copy editing, you have to intuit what the person's up to, and just make it consistent. I think that's a delicate and difficult thing to do, and it's more art than science, it seems to me.
Yeah, and I think that I could be wrong about this because I've only been copy editing and stuff for about 10 years. I never copy edited prior to the age of Google. And I have a theory that one of the reasons people misunderstand what copy editors do is because it actually has shifted a little bit. It used to be true before there was just Google and Wikipedia, although Wikipedia is not a good primary source and should never be cited, but it can be a handy way sometimes to check a fact that you know is true, but you just want to make sure you know it. But you're never supposed to cite it as a definitive source. Anyway, before those things existed, it was really necessary for copy editors to have often deep subject matter knowledge, you know? And this might be less true of fiction, for example, but like if you were publishing a history book, you would send it to a copy editor who specialized in that thing, because it would be their job to say, no, this didn't happen in 1937, it happened in 1932, and no, you know, that speech was given before blah, 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 and they'll be able to do that work faster if they do not have to look up every single one of those facts, because the popular, you know, assertion is that books are not fact-checked, and that is true. We are not legally obligated when publishing a book to make sure that all the facts are correct. That is the author's problem. But the copy editor's goal is to prevent silly mistakes from slipping through. You know, like you want to make sure that somebody has put 2 L's in Winston Churchill's name or whatever. And so it is helpful when there was no internet that could just pull this information up for you. It was really helpful to be really knowledgeable. And I think that put some copy editors in a different position in relation to the author, where they felt that they were supposed to be an authority. And it often creates very contentious relationships between authors and copy editors. A production editor that I worked for once advised me to never use my name when I was copy editing in Word. You know, like it'll have a comment that says, oh, Molly Pisani said blah, blah, blah. And he was like, just put copy editor, because I find that authors, when they're going through your copy edit, if they can see your name, they'll start to get like really snarky in their comments back. They'll be like, no, Molly, that wasn't what, you know? If you're just copy editor, it's like a little more depersonalized. They might not be so resistant. But anyway, so the point is, I think that for an older generation of copy editors, there was more of a sense that you needed to be the authority. And it's different now when you don't have to be so much of a specialist. What you benefit most from is being somebody who listens really well. And I think that I listen really well to what authors are trying to do when I'm copy editing, because of my prior training as a developmental editor, where, you know, voice is sacred, author's intent is sacred, sort of. I definitely, when I copy edit, one of the biggest things I do that I think helps the author, because I rarely have contact with the author directly as a copy editor, that almost never happens. So one of the things I do that I learned from developmental editing is I always highlight like little moments or sentences or good points or anything that I think is interesting or praiseworthy. I put a little comment in there because it's like author candy. You know, if I'm about to rearrange all of your commas, it's important to let people know that there's something that I'm really engaged with. And that was something that I learned in editing, because when I first started out, I would just give people all my notes, and I would not start out with the requisite paragraph of like, here's what's great about it. And people would come back just devastated, being like, oh my God, you know, should I even be writing this? And so I learned that you always have to give praise in addition to constructive criticism.
Right.
And taking that practice into my copy editing, I think helps people swallow the parts of it that they enjoy less.
Right. I love that phrase, author candy.
Yeah.
Molly Pisani, thank you so much for being with us today. Really enjoyed listening to you talk about these varied and wonderfully diverse issues. We will. I'm thinking of you in Queens, my native Queens, and I'm delighted that that you've chosen the borough.
That's right, greatest borough. Woo!